As I said, thanks again for the opportunity to present at the Lunch and Learn. I always enjoy doing this, and hopefully you'll have me back in the future. Today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the new insights that are coming out of my lab and through collaborations with a wide variety of organizations to better understand the marine portion of the salmon life cycle, and in particular thinking about temperature preferences and distribution of both juvenile and subadult salmon in the marine environment. And as always, the sort of research that we do is done as a team. So a lot of the specific topics I'm going to present were done in collaboration with Dr. Joe Langan, who's a former postdoctoral researcher in my lab, who excitingly has moved on to a position with the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory, and Lillian Hart, a former master's student of mine. So just in terms of background, before I dive right in, I know I see from the crowd, some of you I've met before, but in general, my name is Curry Cunningham. I'm an associate professor with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but actually based down in Juneau. Our fisheries department is split between Juneau and Fairbanks. In addition to that, I'm one of the core faculty members for the University of Washington Alaska Salmon Program, or maybe better known as FRI, or the Fisheries Research Program. So in addition to this body of research, I'm going to talk about describing kind of what we're learning about the marine portion of the salmon life cycle. I'm also involved in a lot of research kind of in freshwater ecosystems, thinking about bear salmon predator-prey dynamics, juvenile salmonid ecology, salmon habitat, as well as in-season and pre-season forecasting efforts. But in general, I wanted to give a little bit of a background on the kind of work that my lab does at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We have a pretty broad research focus, but one of the core aspects is the population and spatial dynamics of salmon and groundfish. And so some of the key questions that we're often asking are, what processes in the environment drive variation in growth and survival of different species, particularly salmon? And within that, we're trying to better understand how we can predict species distributions in the marine environment, where things are likely to be, and often what sort of habitat attributes, whether it's temperature, whether it's other aspects of the prey that they're feeding on, drive where particular species are found in the marine environment. And we often do this using a wide variety of survey data. I'll talk about kind of surface trawl survey data that tells us something about the distribution of juvenile salmon. We also use fishery-dependent catch data, or bycatch data. So thinking about Eastern Bering Sea trawl fisheries, as all of us know, they catch both chum and Chinook salmon. And in addition to thinking about the impacts of those mortalities on fish returning to freshwater, we can also leverage those observations to learn something about the distribution of chum salmon I'll talk about specifically, and maybe help inform ways that fleets can avoid bycatch to the extent possible. And also learning about what are effective harvest or bycatch mitigation strategies, particularly when we think about kind of the spatial distribution of salmon in the marine environment. We also do a lot of work using kind of life cycle models, sort of thinking about survival from one stage to the next. So egg to fry, fry to smolt, smolt to adult throughout the marine portion of the life cycle, and try to think about and learn about what specific processes, what aspects of the environment, be it temperature, be it prey availability, regulate survival. I also spend a lot of work or a lot of time developing some of the tools we use for abundance forecasting, both on the preseason end and the in-season end. So I lead the UWFRI preseason, in-season Bristol Bay forecast team. Now I'm going to be talking a lot today about species distribution models, and I'll talk about what those are in a little bit. But these are generally sort of statistical methods we use to sort of analyze either survey data or maybe fishery-dependent data, bycatch data, to learn about species distribution, quantify it, and link it to environmental factors that might drive where and when we tend to see salmon out in the marine environment. And we often use these species distribution models in a couple different ways, both for kind of retrospective, kind of looking in the rear view mirror, what happened, and also sort of prospective, kind of forward looking to see if we can identify areas where we're more or less likely to see salmon in the marine environment. And as a couple of examples of how this sort of research is applied within the sort of federal fishery management realm, there's a requirement to identify what's called essential fish habitat, or EFH. And that's kind of an example of a retrospective application. We look at where we've seen salmon in the past, maybe their habitat associations, to identify what places within the marine environment are particularly important for specific life stages. Now, federal essential fish habitat, this is for crabs, this is for groundfish, but it's also for salmon at different life stages. And I'll speak to a little bit of the work we're doing trying to better inform the salmon end of the essential fish habitat definition process. In general, we're also trying to just get an improved understanding of spatial ecology, what drives where we tend to see species out in the marine environment, and also when, how that varies across the year from season to season. And also from a sort of prospective or forward-looking perspective, we're also trying to assess whether or not we can provide some tools to better inform areas of high or low bycatch risk, particularly for chum salmon, so that fleets can avoid them to the extent possible. Um, Let's see. So that brings me to the focus of today's talk. I'm not going to be talking about freshwater processes. I'm not going to be talking about fun bear salmon work or salmon habitat work. We're going to be focusing on the marine portion of the salmon life cycle. And there's sort of a couple different stories baked into this talk. One deals with sort of indexing juvenile salmon in the sort of year of outmigration. So surveys that are taking place in September, maybe into early October. So thinking about as these smolts have gone to sea and begin to distribute themselves from a Bristol Bay perspective across the eastern Bering Sea, where do we see them and when, and how variable is that among years? And also thinking about latter marine stages. So as these salmon spend additional years in the ocean, they might redistribute to different places, and depending on their stock of origin, may have different preferences for different habitats. So our focus is going to be on the marine phase today. Um, I wanted to highlight early on, there's a couple exciting new papers that have come out of my lab or in collaboration with others in the last year. One is this paper, Opening the Black Box, New Insights in the Role of Temperature in the Marine Distribution of Pacific Salmon. That was led by Joe Langan, who I chatted about earlier, also with some collaborators. Particularly, I want to highlight Skip McKinnell. He was formerly with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. He's now retired, but is having a hard time retiring, it would appear. He's still very involved in some of this high seas research. And in particular, compiling some of the data that led to some of the analyses we were able to do, given his long tenure with Fisheries and Oceans. And the second is a piece of work I'll talk about as well, kind of exploring expansion of salmon, presumably from kind of eastern Bering Sea region, up along the Alaskan coast and into the western Canadian Arctic. And this project, led by Karen Dunmall, was really an attempt to address some of the concerns that have been brought forward by some of the regional hunter and trapper committees in the Western Canadian Arctic regarding kind of increasing prevalence of salmon and some of their subsistence catches in that region, and trying to better understand what are the conditions that drive years when they expect to see high or low salmon abundance in their nets. Um, I'm gonna throw around the word species distribution model, or SDM, quite a bit today, so I kind of wanted to break that down just in a general and approachable way for folks who might not be familiar with these types of methods. So these are basically ways that we can attempt to describe the presence or absence or abundance of species across space, and then how those distributions, how the presence or abundance of species across space in the marine environment might vary over time. As I said before, right, we use these in a couple of different ways, looking backward, looking forward. And one of the sort of key areas of research for my lab is to think about kind of what are the best tools we can bring to bear to take these abundance data, maybe from surveys or observations of bycatch across space and across time, and derive some inference from them. And so there's a couple different kind of classes of methods that we use. One are generalized additive models, or GAMs, that sort of can be used to generate a representation of or describe distribution in space and time. Another, what are called vector autoregressive spatiotemporal models. We don't need to get into the nitty gritty, but another way that we can try to derive this sort of inference. And the last one are sort of machine learning methods, kind of new and novel approaches that are pretty flexible when you have enough data to try to, again, describe these patterns in species distribution in space and time. So the first project I want to talk about that was in collaboration with Joe up here in the left here, looking rather stunning, and collaborators at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, was to try to bring together as much of the information on high seas salmon distribution across the North Pacific as possible. So starting in the mid to late 1950s, the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission, or formerly the INPFC, was sort of the central location coordinating high seas salmon research efforts from across a wide range of countries, primarily US, Canada, Russia, Japan, and Korea. And so what I have plotted below are basically individual survey observations. So this is each point is a individual place where gear was deployed to try to index the abundance of salmon. This is across months over the year. This is across different sort of decadal stanzas. So the mid 50s up through the early 70s, the 70s up through the early 90s, and the 90s up through the mid to late 2000s. And so the red points are individual survey observations that used high seas gill nets to try to index salmon abundance. And those blue diamonds are where high seas long lines were used to try to index salmon abundance. So there's a couple things that I want to highlight. One is that the majority of this sort of historical NPAFC-led high seas salmon sampling occurred primarily during the spring and summer months. So as you go from April to May, June, July, and August, we tend to see the highest number of observations historically. The winter time is a particularly hard time to be out there in the North Pacific trying to sample salmon on the high seas. So pretty sparse observations from this sort of September to March period. The other thing I want to draw your attention to, in addition to the fact that, in the Western North Pacific, there tended to be greater use of gill nets for indexing salmon versus in the Eastern North Pacific over here, there tended to be more kind of long line observations. There's also some imbalance across time. So a lot of these high seas survey efforts were really in their prime in the 1950s up through the late 1980s. By the beginning of the 1990s and up through the 2000s, a lot of this sort of North Pacific scale sampling effort had really gone away. So that's an important point to keep in mind as we start thinking about how we can use these data and why we need some of those statistical methods I was talking about to account for this sort of imbalance in where and when different areas were sampled, and to some extent what gear was used to sample salmon on the high seas. So in general, one of our goals for this project was to bring all these data together. They'd been held by different organizations in different countries. They hadn't all been brought together in electronic format. And one of our concerns is that the number of people who had participated in these high seas surveys were getting fewer and fewer, either retiring or some of those folks were no longer with us. And so it was really exciting to have Skip McKinnell aboard, who had participated in some of these high seas sampling efforts, had great connections across from Japan, Canada, and the US, and was able to coerce his colleagues to open up old dusty filing cabinets and send us the data so we can compile it in a standardized format. So my hat's off to Skip for a lot of effort towards the end of his career and really trying to make these data usable so we can do the types of analyses that I'm going to present today. Kind of as an interesting aside, most of the kind of standardized data reporting forms didn't include a section for catches of steelhead. And so Skip actually taught himself the Japanese character for steelhead because it was often recorded in sort of the notes in the margin, so we could bring those data in as well. But our goal in synthesizing these sort of North Pacific scale high seas salmon survey data were to as best we can, come up with a comprehensive description of salmon distributions across the North Pacific, both by species and by month, and to expand our understanding of the thermal or temperatural preferences that each of these species of salmon exhibit. In addition to sort of deploying the survey gear, often environmental information was collected. So it might take a surface temperature or even more rarely temperature at depth, but that can help us better describe what the temperature preferences are for these different salmon species. So taking those data and applying some of these SDM methods that we talked about before, we were able to generally describe the sort of the average distribution. When I say average, I mean average across years distribution of different salmon species across this region in different months of the year. So I'll present a series of these figures. In general, the more yellow areas are the areas of higher relative abundance of salmon. The more kind of blue into purple areas are areas of lower predicted relative abundance. And this is for chum salmon in particular. Each panel is an individual month. And as I said before, the majority of this high seas salmon sampling effort from the 50s forward occurred during the summer months. But in general, you can start to pick out some really interesting patterns. So here for chum salmon, we see over the course of the season in May here, most of these chum that were caught were distributed south of the Aleutians, further south of the North Pacific. And then as we move into June, July, and into August, we see this general northward shift. So chum salmon on aggregate seem to move from south of the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians up into the eastern Bering Sea and central Bering Sea over the course of the season. And this generally aligns with observations of bycatch of chum in eastern Bering Sea trawl fisheries. It tends to occur primarily during bee season, so thinking about moving into the summer months. And this is when this mass of chum salmon is really exiting the North Pacific and moving further north up into the eastern Bering Sea. Sadly, that means there's more overlap with trawl fleets and potential for bycatch. But these sort of general distributional patterns seem to align with what we see in terms of bycatch rates. We can look at a sort of similar description of distribution across months for Chinook salmon. So these are Chinook salmon from all over, not just from Alaska, although in many cases, as we'll see, particularly when we get to sockeye, the majority of that distribution may be driven, in fact, by production of sockeye salmon in Alaska and elsewhere. But we see some interesting patterns. Again, this sort of as we're in April into May and up into June, we see this movement pattern for Chinook salmon kind of moving northward as the North Pacific warms up, as the Bering Sea becomes this sort of production hotspot. We also tend to see these interesting aggregations of really high relative abundance of Chinook in this particular region here in June and July. So this is an area along the eastern Bering Sea shelf edge where it dropped from kind of a wide, flat eastern Bering Sea shelf out into the deeper waters. And there's some interesting oceanography in that region. You have kind of upwelling of deeper, nutrient-rich, colder waters up onto the shelf edge into what we think of as the photic zone or the really productive zone up near the surface. And so you see high primary production, high production of phytoplankton. And of course, from that, we get secondary production or zooplankton production, and it sort of propagates through the food web, but lots of feeding opportunity for Chinook. We can kind of zoom in a little bit here and see again. So here we are. There's Bristol Bay there. There's you there. This is the wide, flat, and open kind of eastern Bering Sea shelf. And again, this area of particularly high Chinook salmon relative abundance within this region in the summer months in June and July seems to be right off the shelf edge. So in this area of really high primary production, which is fascinating and speaks to this idea when we start thinking about what are the processes in the environment that drive where we see salmon out there. Some of it has to do with temperature. It also has to do with where food are available, right? Where the forage is available for these fish. So this sort of green belt area, this production hotspot seems to be an aggregator of Chinook salmon within this region. We can turn to one of my favorite species, sockeye salmon, and again, look at these same plots of the predicted distribution or relative abundance across space, going from April to May to June, July, and August. And we see this sort of interesting pattern that I think some of us are probably pretty familiar with. We see sockeye moving from the Gulf of Alaska right here and south of the Aleutians up through along the south edge of the Alaska Peninsula, through the passes, past False Pass, and then up into the Bristol Bay region. So again, this is the distribution of all sockeye that were caught in these high sea surveys, but it shows this really pronounced pattern and really the importance in terms of the magnitude of sockeye out there that are bound for Bristol Bay as they come hit the south side of the Alaska Peninsula, filter through the passes, turn the corner, and then head towards Bristol Bay. And then by the end of July, beginning of August, we see a sort of broader distribution to sockeye out there. So after these returning adult sockeye have presumably made it either into our nets or up onto the spawning grounds, we see a broadening of that distribution. One of the other ways we can look at this is sort of over time. So what I have here is basically, again, the same idea of the predicted relative abundance, warmer colors, higher predicted relative abundance of sockeye, cooler colors, lower predicted relative abundance of sockeye. And this is just counting up over days. And I'll let this loop through. So here we are in April, this massive sockeye out here, pouring through the passes and then up towards Bristol Bay. So for me, as a former commercial fisherman here in 2006, sitting on the banks of the Naknek River, I was always scratching my head thinking, when are the fish going to show up and where are they coming from? And so to me, it's really exciting to be able to pull together this 50 years of high sea salmon survey data to really describe that distribution pattern for sockeye and how it moves across the season, and particularly what that means from a Bristol Bay perspective, which seems to drive or dominate some of the spatial patterns that we see. One of the other kind of important and interesting aspects of bringing together these NPFC high sea salmon survey data was to get a better understanding of temperature preferences across species. So what I have plotted over here is basically two things. So here's our species on the y-axis, sockeye chum, pink, even and odd year brood lines, Chinook, steelhead, and coho. And these bands describe basically the temperature preference ranges for these different species based on these data. So at what temperatures did we observe higher or lower catch rates for these salmon? And so this broad colored region is what we think of as sort of the preferred temperature range for each species. It's sort of the 80% highest density interval there. And then this kind of darker band is what we think of as the core temperature range, really the areas that they're most likely to occupy. And so there's a couple of things to note. The first is that across species, kind of the upper temperature limit for the preferred temperature range is pretty consistent. Nobody really likes to be in areas that are above 12.5 degrees Celsius. That's right. When we start thinking about particularly the southern extent of the salmon range in the North Pacific, there's probably a lower bound. And that lower bound may be changing over time as the North Pacific warms under climate change. At the other end of the spectrum, at the cooler end, we see a lot of differences among species in terms of their preferred temperature range as well as their core temperature range. So up here, we see that sockeye and chum salmon are pretty happy down below 2.5 degrees, down to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. So sockeye and chum are the most cold tolerant, at least based on these data, out in the marine environment. They're more likely to occupy some of these cooler habitats out there. At the other end of the spectrum, we have coho and and steelhead. They tend to be, I guess, the less cold tolerant, or maybe the ones that are afraid of cold water out there. So we see that their preferred temperature range doesn't really extend below 5.5 to 6 degrees. So for steelhead and coho, we tend to not see them in these areas with cooler water. And this is really interesting, not only from thinking about kind of broad scale distribution and how this relates to where we tend to see these different species across the North Pacific, but also the implications for what is the preferred habitat, at least from a temperature perspective, for these different species as waters continue to warm in this region. So one of the things we did was with those sort of temperature ranges or those preferred temperature ranges in hand, we compared two periods. We compared a cold period that extended from about 1983 to 1986 with a warm period between 2013 and 2016, and asked the question across months and across different species here, sockeye, chum, and coho salmon. Um, Under a warming period, where do we expect to see higher abundance of these different species? So in these plots here, again, this is sockeye, chum, and coho. This is April, May, June, July, and August. So areas of red in this are areas where we expect higher habitat suitability based on temperature under a warmer period versus areas in blue are areas of lower habitat suitability under a warmer period. So as I said before, at the upper end of that temperature kind of preference range, most species don't want to be above 12.5 degrees. That's just not optimal for them. So under warming conditions, kind of across months, maybe with the exception of April, we tend to see lower habitat suitability, more blue down at the southern extent of the range in the North Pacific. At the opposite end, we can think about under warming conditions for some of these species. There's areas either within, this is for chum salmon here, within the eastern Bering Sea shelf region and up into Bristol Bay in May, or even further north in June. We expect higher suitability for these areas under a warming climate or during a warmer period for chum salmon in May and June. Here for coho, under a warming climate pattern, we expect higher suitability again as we get into June, further up north, up here into the eastern Bering Sea shelf region, and maybe July even further north. Again, under this idea that coho tend to be fairly cold temperature intolerant. They tend to be a little afraid of cold temperatures. And so additional warming means that we have increased suitability for some of the Bering Sea habitat for species like coho. So that's one of the interesting things from my perspective, thinking 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, if we see continued warming, are we going to see a shift in the mix of salmon species we see in the eastern Bering Sea and potentially where we find them further north up into the Arctic? Are some of those habitats going to become more suitable in the future than they are right now? As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the other kind of areas of interest for us is sort of differences in the predicted distribution of salmon species across time, but also when you use different sort of statistical methods to infer their distribution. So what I have plotted on the top is the predicted distribution for sockeye salmon built using sort of predicted using boosted regression trees, so a machine learning method versus generalized additive models. They're kind of two different ways that we can approach unpacking or predicting distribution across time. And depending on the tool that you use, you get a slightly different outcome, but in general, the same kind of inference comes out, right? We have the same areas are identified as sort of preferred habitat to some extent, although there are some differences when you use these machine learning methods, you tend to get kind of a boxier description of preferred habitat versus these generalized additive models. And the same is true when we think about a species like chum salmon pictured here. Depending on the tool that you use, you identify the same areas that are expected to be have high chum salmon abundance across the North Pacific and across these months. Depending on the tool that you use, the inference can be slightly different. But thankfully, I think from our perspective, you tend to pick up the same patterns independent of which tool that you use, which gives us a little more confidence in interpreting those results. So, in addition to this effort to leverage these sort of broad scale North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission data from the 1950s forward to learn about distribution and temperature preferences, um, after we had begun that work, we got in touch with a collaborator, Karen Dunmall at Fisheries and Oceans Canada, who has done a lot of work with Indigenous communities in the Western Canadian Arctic, thinking about what types of species they see in their subsistence catches, and particularly this observation over the last 20 years that Inuit and Gwich'in harvesters had been reporting more and more salmon showing up in their nets. Now, there had always been salmon caught to some extent, right? When you go up to this area in Western Canada, there is a traditional word for many of these salmon species, right? They're not new, they've been there before. People have been catching them and observing them for a long time. But the observation was in the last 20 years, there are more and more salmon showing up in subsistence nets. And that raised a lot of questions from some of these subsistence harvesters. This potential range expansion of salmon up into the Western Canadian Arctic was considered by some to be a possible threat to traditional fisheries for char in particular. And so there's a lot of questions from folks in that region asking, one, why are we seeing more salmon up here? Two, what are the potential impacts? How are they going to interact with some of our traditionally harvested species up here? And so part of this was to leverage what we had learned from the previous study in terms of these optimal temperature preferences for different species and determine what conditions in a couple of regions in the Arctic might lead to more or less salmon showing up in harvest in these communities in the Western Canadian Arctic. And in particular, we focused on two areas. So this is the Chukchi Sea here, and this is the Beaufort Sea up here. And so under this general idea that we expect some of the salmon that are showing up in genetic evidence for the salmon that are showing up in subsistence catches, that these are of Alaskan origin primarily, right? We wanted to understand what are the processes that facilitate drawing salmon northward up here through the Chukchi, turning the corner, making this right-hand turn, following the coastline through the Beaufort Sea, and ending up in harvest in these communities in the Western Canadian Arctic. So in order to explore that, we sort of identified two what we call watch zones. So the first one is here described by this box in the Chukchi Sea. And we looked at basically the average June sea surface temperature among years in this region. The second watch zone that we identified was up here in the Beaufort Sea, and we looked at the duration of days in which the temperature exceeded 2 degrees Celsius in the nearshore region. So under the idea that when you have kind of gate one open, you have warm temperatures in June here, it might be drawing salmon further north. And then if we have this sort of narrow band of warm water above 2-degree water along the coastline in the Beaufort Sea, this might allow salmon to pass eastward and then show up in some of these tributaries and coastal communities. So what I'm going to show here are a couple different individual kind of figures showing on the top. This is the pattern in sea surface temperature. So as I start kind of this image, it's going to tick forward across days. It's going to show the temperature pattern moving in from April 1st here throughout the summer. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see little red dots appear. The size of those red dots is the magnitude of the salmon catches in subsistence harvests for these communities. Down on the bottom, what I have shown here and what you'll see basically as this advances is ice retreat. So areas that are black are areas that are covered in ice. Areas that are more blue is lower kind of ice. And then here, down here in kind of the whitish greenish, those are areas that are ice free. So we can see higher temperature in red, lower temperature in blue. Basically, as the season progresses, of course, ice retreats further north, and we can count up what is the average temperature within our box one, our first gate that might allow salmon movement into the Arctic, and then our second gate up here. And so we can contrast what we have here. I'll restart this in just a second. What we see over here in a year like 2012. So on the left, I have 2012. On the right, I have 2017. So in 2012, there were very few salmon caught in subsistence harvest in these communities, right? So these circles are relatively small. In 2017, many salmon were caught in these communities. So if we look back at this, we'll see that 2012 was a year where it was fairly cold in the Chukchi Sea, but we had a decent number of kind of ice-free, warm days up in the Beaufort Sea. So we'll allow this play through again. So June sea surface temperature ended up on average to be about half a degree Celsius. There were about 92 days above 2 degrees Celsius, and we had fairly low salmon catches up there. In contrast, as we look through 2017, right? We'll see as the season progresses, ice retreats fairly quickly here in the Chukchi. June sea surface temperature increases up to about 3.7 degrees, and there were, let's see, it counts up. I think there's over 100 days in which temperature within that second box, 80 days, is above was above 2 degrees. So in this year, we saw more salmon caught in this region, and it was associated with warmer temperatures. So this first gate was open, allowing salmon passage, and we had a decent number of ice-free days and warm temperatures up here in the Beaufort. We can contrast that with a year like 2018. So in 2018, again, I'll just play this through. This was a year in which few salmon were caught. We're not going to see very large red circles over here. But this is a year when we saw warm conditions in the Chukchi, but fewer ice-free days up here in the Beaufort Sea, right? Ice retreat was very late to non-existent. And so we didn't see this band of 2 degree or greater warm water along the northern coast of Alaska. So in this case, we had gate one open, but not gate two. And as a result, the sort of total number of salmon observed in subsistence catches were fairly low. So in general, the conclusions were that the relative abundance of salmon in these subsistence harvests really depends on both warm water in warm sea surface temperature in June in the Chukchi and sustained warm waters in the Beaufort Sea over the course of the summer season. And together, these two kind of predictors, these two watch zones explained a lot of the variability in salmon catches over time. And a key part of determining those temperature patterns in the near shore in both of these regions was the timing of ice retreat. Ice plays a key role in this region in terms of dictating to what extent we see warm conditions or suitable conditions for salmon movement in that direction. So, in addition to that, some of the other work that we have ongoing is to try to better understand the distribution of chum salmon in the Eastern Bering Sea on a stock by stock basis or by genetic reporting group. So, as I said before, one of the areas of research that my lab pursues is trying to develop tools to better predict the distribution of chum salmon in the Eastern Bering Sea to enhance the ability of trawl fleets to avoid chum salmon, right? And particularly, we want to avoid harvest of Alaskan origin chum salmon, right? Out in the Eastern Bering Sea, there's a mix of Asian, particularly Japanese hatchery chum. There's also Western Alaska chum salmon, all mixing out in this zone. So we have some work ongoing with collaborators in the genetics program at NOAA, as well as using information on bycatch of chum salmon out in the Eastern Bering Sea to inform kind of the distribution of Asian origin versus Alaska origin chum salmon, again, to inform bycatch mitigation in this region. And so one of the things we did was to apply some of these machine learning methods to try to better predict distribution and to learn what factors, what predictors were useful in describing where and when chum salmon were encountered. And so what I have plotted up here is the relative importance of different predictors. And I realize that the font is a little small, but basically the further this point is to the right, the more important that predictor is, or the more useful that predictor is in describing whether or not chum salmon actually show up in a particular region in space and time. So the most important predictors in this case were the latitude, the day of the year, right? The longitude, the bottom depth, so whether you're on shelf or off shelf, also the time of day, and then sea surface temperature, bottom temperature, moon phase, and a few of these other predictors. And so we begin to see some of these interesting patterns, right? One is that in general, you tend to see higher bycatch of these chum salmon in pelagic trawls. So thinking about pollock trawl gear during the daytime versus the nighttime. So this is just the relative catch rate as we go from night into day and back into night. So there's greater risk or greater overlap between the distribution of these chum salmon that are doing their sort of vertical migration in the water column between day and night during the daytime. There seems to be more overlap. At the same time, again, we can use this information to kind of learn something about the distribution of expected chum salmon abundance here across the Eastern Bering Sea shelf. This is during B season, so during the summertime season. And we see that generally you see this spread of higher relative abundance of chum salmon down here in the southeast, moving kind of north and west along the shelf break. So from a sort of bycatch mitigation perspective, the hope is that we can sort of use this information to better provide guidance on maybe areas to avoid day over day and under what conditions we might avoid them. And then down the line, as part two of this project, connect that up with the available genetic information on bycatch to say, okay, in particular, not just on aggregate for chum, but particularly where are you most likely to see Western Alaska chum salmon? And therefore, what are the areas that we might want to avoid most or the fleet might want to avoid most? In addition to sort of thinking about the sort of adult slash subadult sort of life stages for salmon in the marine environment, my lab has also been doing a lot of work to better understand juvenile salmon distribution in the marine environment, and particularly define what I talked about before in terms of essential fish habitat. These areas where we often see juvenile salmon that might be areas we want to protect from any sort of development or any sort of activity that might adversely impact them. So, our objectives are to sort of quantify the static, the stationary areas of high juvenile salmon abundance in the eastern and northern Bering Sea, and then ask the question, how much does that vary across time, among years or under different conditions? And also to sort of compare these predictions between different ways that we might estimate them. So this work is based on service trawl survey data that's conducted by NOAA, by the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. So this is just a plot of the kind of the survey observations across time. It's a little imbalanced. Different years, they had different levels of funding. There were different targets. Generally, the northern Bering Sea is always surveyed. The southeastern Bering Sea is surveyed kind of every other year, depending on the number of vessel days that are available. But from this, we can infer a couple different things. We can infer the relative distribution of the species. So these are juvenile sockeye salmon caught in generally August through October, but primarily September in their year of outmigration. So they've exited Bristol Bay and are headed out to sea. So areas of more yellow, these are areas of higher relative abundance of these juvenile sockeye, areas of blue or lower relative abundance of juvenile sockeye. From that, we can quantify on aggregate what is the sort of area in which we see the majority of these juvenile sockeye, what we think of as describing the top 95% of the abundance of juvenile sockeye out there for essential fish habitat. And then we can define sort of the core habitat. What are the areas where we see the top 50% of predicted abundance, those areas that are even more important or the most important from a conservation perspective, because they tend to have the highest abundance of juvenile sockeye in this case over time. So here we see that this area of essential fish habitat kind of extends here along the 50-meter isobath, so areas around 50 meters in depth, extending from Bristol Bay outward, and this sort of core essential fish habitat areas right outside Bristol Bay. This is where we tend to see a large number of those juvenile sockeye and is especially important for conservation. We can sort of compare this across species. So I have Chinook over here, juvenile pink salmon and juvenile sockeye salmon. And what we see in general, some differences in sort of predicted distribution, as we saw before for sockeye, really centered here in Bristol Bay, but extending along this 50-meter depth band, right? Here for pink salmon, we tend to see higher abundance. They're spread out across the eastern and northern Bering Sea region, but some hotspots of pink salmon abundance further north. And then for Chinook salmon, we tend to see them closer inshore. Juvenile Chinook salmon tend to be a little closer inshore inside of that 50-meter depth boundary and extending up here into Norton Sound and then all the way down into Bristol Bay, kind of as we would expect. This likely reflects salmon exiting from the Yukon, salmon exiting from the Kuskokwim, Chinook salmon, and of course, salmon coming out of the Nushagak River, right? So different ways that we can describe differences in the distribution of these juvenile rather than adult salmon in the eastern and northern Bering Sea. Again, we can kind of look across from an essential fish habitat perspective. We can draw that area here. here in purple or in blue, depending on which method you use to define it, this essential fish habitat area, this area that should be used to define kind of protection activities or evaluate whether or not a certain activity should occur. Here for Chinook salmon, for sockeye salmon, it's a little further south and centered in Bristol Bay. Pink salmon, it's a little more broad, as we saw from that distribution. And for chum salmon, again, extending up. Lots of essential fish habitat up here in and around Norton Sound, chum salmon coming out of the Yukon and the northern Bering Sea, and then extending further south as well. So again, the area that you would want to conserve from an essential fish habitat perspective really depends on species. So the second question is, if you put in sort of spatial protection measures, essential fish habitat that's static in time, how likely is that to be effective on a year-over-year basis? We know that as we saw before, the distribution of salmon shifts among years in response to different environmental conditions. So how much does it vary across time? So this is for sockeye salmon. This is again, the sort of EFH top 95% of predicted abundance is described by this sort of shaded region here in red, predicted by one method, or blue by another method. And this is just looking across individual years. So you ask, what is this essential fish habitat area among years? And one thing you see is, of course, it varies a bit over time. Where you encounter fish does depend on the year and the different conditions. But in general, some of the same core habitats are identified in terms of essential fish habitat year over year. So from a conservation perspective, although the distribution shifts in response to where prey are and maybe what the temperature conditions are, there are areas identified routinely year over year as essential fish habitat, in this case for juvenile sockeye salmon. The final piece I want to talk about is a little more applied. So one of the other ways that we've been using these surface trawl survey data that index juvenile sockeye salmon out in the marine environment is to inform some of the work we do in generating preseason forecasts for how many adult fish are returning in future years. So what we can do is look at the distribution of juvenile sockeye salmon from these surface trawl survey data out in the marine environment. Again, more yellow colors or higher abundance. This is predicted abundance. More blue colors, lower predicted abundance. And what we see, again, there's some core areas, but we also see some variation across time in is there more yellow or less yellow? And that gives us an idea of whether or not there's more juvenile sockeye out there or fewer juvenile sockeye. And so we can start to pick up some patterns, right? So here we had this period of sort of relatively high, lots of yellow here up through about 2005, generally cooler colors up here through 2012 and 2013. And then it picks back up and we see more yellow in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19, right? So this time period, this is again indexing juvenile sockeye in the year of outmigration, aligns with when we've seen this pickup or increase in return abundance of adult salmon to Bristol Bay in particular. So this is where we can take these sort of predictions for juvenile salmon abundance based on the survey data and come up with an index of juvenile abundance in the year of outmigration. And what that shows is in this period up through about 2007, we had higher juvenile salmon abundance. That was followed by a year of lower juvenile salmon abundance. It picks back up and peaks here in 2019. 2019 was a particular year of incredibly high juvenile salmon abundance observed out in the eastern Bering Sea. So those fish that were caught as juveniles in 2019 would have returned in 2021 and 2022 as adults. So this begins to align with what we see in terms of catch and escapement return abundance of adult sockeye some number of years later. So that's all well and good. If we have this index of juvenile salmon abundance, sockeye salmon abundance in the year of outmigration, in order to come up with a prediction for how many adults are going to return down the line, we need to take this index of juvenile salmon abundance that describes year-to-year variation in these juveniles in the year of ocean entry, and we need to basically forecast the number that are going to return several years down the line as adults. So we need to align the index from a couple outmigration years here, 2021 and 2022, with the years that they would have returned as 3 ocean adults. In this case, it'd be 2024 for those fish that went to sea in 2021, and 2024 for 2 ocean adults that went to sea in 2022. So we can begin to sort of predict the return abundance of adult salmon conditional on the index of juveniles outmigrating in successive years, 2 to 3 years prior, or excuse me, 2 to 3 years prior to when we see them return as adults. And so when we do that, there's actually a decent relationship. So when you take this juvenile index, you convert it to a calendar year in which those juveniles should return, you add it up across the fish that would have spent 2 or 3 years in the ocean, you end up with this sort of relationship between this high sea salmon index of juvenile salmon abundance and the observed run size in millions on the y-axis here. So each point is an individual year between 2005 and 2024. And what we see is in these years of really high juvenile salmon abundance 2 to 3 years prior, we tended to see large run sizes subsequently. So here, these bars are the observed run size in Bristol Bay. Obviously are extremely large, greater than 80 million fish return several years ago. These blue and red lines are the model predicted return abundance of adults. And what we see is that it does a pretty good job and suggests in 2025, we might expect a return abundance somewhere a little above 50 million, maybe 50 to 53 million. And in 2026, that's probably going to be down between 43 and 47 million fish. So the key points being that, these basis or high sea salmon survey data provide information on the abundance and condition of juvenile sockeye salmon, in this case, in the eastern and northern Bering Sea in the year of ocean entry, although there's a lot of variation in where that sampling has occurred. But this sort of index of juvenile abundance is useful and likely predicts return abundance of adults because it's after the majority of freshwater and early marine mortality has occurred. And when we do that, we get reasonably good predictive performance for predicting adult returns 2 to 3 years down the line. And as I said before, this based on these juvenile sockeye data up through 2024, this predicts 2025 and 2026 adult returns in somewhere in the 43 to 53 million range. And importantly, relative to the usual preseason forecast that our group at FRI puts out and the state puts out, that's usually 1 year ahead, comes out in November for the subsequent summer. Predictions from these juvenile high seas survey data provide us a bit of a snapshot of what the return abundance might be 2 years down the line, which might be helpful for planning. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you for your interest and for the invitation to present. This is kind of a fun area of research for myself and my lab, thinking about the marine portion of the life cycle, and be happy to take any questions.
Any questions? Yeah, well.
We are seeing increased habitat availability with increased temperatures up north. Are we seeing a likely response in the southern portion of their range, California, Western Oregon, with decreased runs in the future potentially?
Yeah, we've already started to see that for some species in particular areas. So thinking way far down the coast in like the Sacramento River in California, particularly more on the freshwater side, temperatures are increasingly getting warmer. It's above in some cases, the lethal limit for Chinook salmon down there. So on the freshwater side, we've already seen that. On the marine side, it's a little more difficult to tell, but in general, the expectation is that given that most of these salmon don't want to occupy habitats that are above 12.5 degrees, if they don't have the capacity to spend time further north, which it seems like they can probably regulate where they are in the marine environment a little bit, we would expect probably fish that are entering the ocean further south and maybe don't have as much capacity to go way far north to be impacted most directly by a changing climate. But I would say for now, the majority of those sort of climate change impacts we're seeing in the southern extent of the range are often on the freshwater side and to some extent in the nearshore as well.
Hey, Grace, Nisa, I have a question.
Hey.
Hi. Hey, I kind of have a related question, but more on the north slope there. So you had mentioned that some of the salmon we were noticing through genetics, they were Alaskan salmon that were being harvested in Canada. Are we finding that salmon are kind of denying that genetic instinct to not return to their original spawning grounds and they're adapting their spawning grounds? Because I know in the copper we get a variety of genetics. We get salmon from BC all the time going up the copper. So I know it's common, although it's not intuitive to a lot of people. How much are we finding those salmon are Alaskan salmon or those Canadian grounds are flourishing?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, generally our baseline assumption is, pink salmon stray more than, sockeye, and then we have higher homing fidelity for Chinook and others. And that's certainly true. Um, in general, what we're seeing in those catches in the Western Canadian Arctic, they see a couple of sockeye, they see more chum and pink salmon up there, which kind of aligns with which species tend to stray a bit more. Certainly as climate warms and sort of the suitability from a temperature perspective for areas further north become greater and greater, we expect to see more of those fish potentially moving north, following good feeding conditions and turning the corner and ending up over there. Whether or not the actual overall kind of stray rate, the proportion of fish that don't end up coming back to their home stream is increasing, I don't think we know, or at least I don't know. But that would be interesting to explore. Kind of overall, are we seeing higher stray rates now than we were in the past? We're certainly seeing salmon in different locations or at higher abundance in locations we didn't see as many of them in the past. But whether or not the overall stray rate is higher, I don't know.
Thank you.
It's a great question.
All right, it looks like that's it. Thank you, Curry. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.